Uh, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final Iscia seminar for this semester, Games and Play. And today's talk is going to invite us to think about play, not as something kind of trivial or escapist, but as something deeply political, connective, and transformative. So on land, so much of human life is kind of structured by borders and fences, and ownership and exclusion. Our cities, nations, institutions are marked by boundaries that tell us where we can go, who belongs, who doesn't. But the ocean is different. It's a different kind of space. It's fluid, moving, really harder to enclose. So it's one of the few places on Earth where openness and encounter still feel possible. Okay, so in this seminar, Dr. Alex Lenferna, a newly appointed research associate of the university, hosted by the Iscia chair, will explore what it means to engage with the ocean playfully through kind of swimming and surfing and freediving, spearfishing, and experiencing the sea, I think really importantly, as a shared commons. So the idea is not that play distracts us from serious social and political questions, but it might actually help us imagine a freer and more connected way of living together. So Alex brings a uniquely rich perspective to these questions. He's been an environmental and social justice activist for nearly 20 years. I know you won't believe it if you look at his face. It doesn't look like he's 20 years old. But alongside his work as the South Africa team lead for the nonprofit Research Plus Action, where he focuses on serious stuff on climate and environmental justice, he's also deeply immersed in the ocean as a surfer, as a freediving instructor, as a spearfisher, and as a marine guide in training. So, Alex, welcome. Very happy to have you talk to us today, and I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Andrea. Much appreciated, and thanks everybody for taking some time out of your Friday afternoon to join for this talk. Yeah, Andrea gave such a lovely summary of what I'm going to be talking about. I feel like I can just leave it there. No, I'm just kidding. Let me open up my slides and see if I can share with you. Cool. Hopefully everybody should be able to see those slides now. So yeah, I gave today's talk the sort of suggestive title of Playing in the Ocean Commons, Subversive, Connective, and Joyful Possibilities. And it really is quite a, let's see if it'll let me change slides, it's quite an exploratory talk. So, I'm not really an expert on the ways that oceans impact us. I'm not a psychologist, but I am very interested in trying to understand the power of playing in the ocean, spending time in the oceans, and what that does to people and how it opens them up to both positive mental and physical health benefits, but also ways in shifting their perspective and their ability to learn and their connection to both themselves and to people and to nature. So this talk is kind of exploring some of that, and also exploring some questions around spiritual connection to the ocean, and also what it means to conceive of places like the ocean as a commons, and some of the problematic ways that we have framed commonses in the past, and how maybe we should think differently when approaching common spaces. And a commons is kind of like a shared natural space that we have supposedly shared access to. So yeah, that's sort of the journey that will be on in this talk today. And it's very sort of exploratory discussions, and some of it is hoping to inform some sort of environmental education initiatives that I'm working on to try and develop here locally in Quebec and Nelson Mandela Bay. And so yeah, I'd love some thoughts and feedback as we go. But I thought, seeing as we're going to be talking about playing in the ocean, I'd share a clip from earlier this week when I was actually playing in the ocean. So this comes from here in Quebec in the bay, and we're actually the bottlenose dolphin capital of the world. We have some of the highest, we call ourselves that anyway, we have some of the highest concentrations of bottlenose dolphins. So I spend a lot of time in the ocean myself, and just thought I'd share one little clip from earlier this week, and I'll kind of refer back to this clip a little bit later on. I'm hoping it evokes some feelings in you, as it did in me. So yeah, that's just a little clip that I thought I would share. Those of you who know the beachfront may be able to recognize some landscapes over there. But maybe to transition from that, I do want to talk a little bit about, some of the work that I'm doing is exploratory, but I think looking back historically for indigenous people, for peoples across South Africa, the oceans are a place of deep spiritual connection. So actually on one of the earlier webinars, Glenn asked me about East London's name change and what it meant. And I was driving at the time, so I actually couldn't answer Glenn. I felt kind of rude. But I'm answering him now, even though he isn't on this webinar. And actually, so East London's had a new name change, and it's called Kurompo. And Kurompo actually refers to a place called Cove Rock, and the sound that the oceans make when they hit the rock there. And so it's actually tied, that's a name that East London had before it was called East London. And that site is also a very historically sacred site where Xhosa kings and prominent figures and prophets used to gather for spiritual upliftment. And so we see in traditional Xhosa culture that sort of spiritual connection to the ocean as a place of gathering, as a place of inspiration and of creativity. And we see it, throughout the Eastern Cape, where we name our places according to ocean spaces, like Ibai. And I think this the spiritual connection to the ocean is something that Shell Oil and Gas didn't take into account when it tried to drive for oil and gas extraction here on the Wild Coast. And it was one of the reasons why they lost in their applications for trying to drill off the Wild Coast, is because amongst the litany of other reasons, like improper process, lack of due consultation, improper environmental impact assessments, and not taking into account climate impacts. But one of the key elements was also the lack of consideration of people's spiritual connection to the ocean and how that would be impacted. And I have the good fortune of hiking with the lead applicant in the case against Shell, Siniguguzukulu, when he first won in the case against Shell on an urgent interdict. And he's a beautiful storyteller, and when you listen to him telling the stories of the connection to the ocean, I mean, there's deep cultural legacies and spiritual legacies there, and so it really does inform, I think, people's connection to the ocean here in the Eastern Cape and across much of the world. But unfortunately, I think, and some of the Iscia folks have seen me talk about this before, but unequal access to the ocean commons is very much defined by histories of environmental injustice, legacies of racism and colonialism and class, still make it such that we have very unequal access to the ocean. And I think this is a map here of the bay. And those who've been on some of the Iscia tours will know that here is Brighton Beach. Here is the more affluent areas of Summerstrand. And historically, this was the sort of the white beaches under apartheid, and this was the black beaches. And there was relocation of black communities to the townships around here, and so they would often only have access to these beaches. And also because of proximity nowadays, that also means that a lot of people who can't afford to travel into Summerstrand still, this is one of the few beaches that they can access as Brighton Beach, but it is a place defined by heavy pollution, sewage, and yeah, I think there's environmental injustice legacies still very much real. And so I think when we talk about ocean commons, it's really important that we factor into the account that not everybody can access those commons. And I think because of the histories of exclusion, spatial apartheid, and lack of access to the ocean, it also means those who are comfortable in the ocean, swimming and so on, is often very much defined by race and class. With that being said, I think this is really important because it also means that, historically, whole black communities don't have access to or equal access to a lot of the benefits that nature provides. Let's see if this thing will allow me to stop playing with the screen and change slides. Okay, there we are. And so I wanted to talk, how do I get rid of these squiggly lines now? I want to see if I can clear them. There we are. Clear all drawings. Okay, cool. Sorry, I'm fiddling around with that for the first time. So yeah, I've been doing some exploration around environmental psychology, trying to look at the ways in which, you know, nature can positively benefit people. And there's this really wonderful book called Nature and the Mind, and in there I'm going to summarize like a vast literature of studies and research, but shows how time in nature can restore our ability to focus, and it particularly helps us with something called directed attention, which is our ability to really focus in on a task for prolonged periods of time. And that direct attention is often eroded by screen time, sort of constant onness of our lives, our digitally connected lives, and cheap dopamine hits. And time in nature also improves mood, alleviates depression, helps with ADHD, it can help create happier, healthy communities, and studies even show it contributes to reductions in crime. And nature increasingly is key in sort of the health sector, where you have prescriptions of access to nature as part of ensuring like a swifter recovery, so it can help in recovery to illness. And studies show that access to green and blue spaces even reduce income-related inequalities and mortality. So a host of benefits. But let me see my thing. Well, let me change screen here because it still thinks I'm trying to play with. Oh, there we are. Okay. But a lot of the research in the last few decades in this field of environmental psychology has looked more at our connection to green spaces, so parks, forests, and the like, but it hasn't focused so much on the oceans. And so newer research is coming out to look at what those benefits look like. And there's sort of like a big caveat about this research. So there was this paper that came out sort of examining the literature, and it says that, you know, the ocean does have an important impact on human health, and observational studies show that ocean-related stimuli can improve human health. But the challenge is that there's very limited research investigating the underlying mechanistic and epidemiological principles. So like, what is it that's actually driving those benefits? It's like connection to the ocean, but what about it is causing those positive benefits? And so the state of the research on this remains somewhat fragmented and somewhat patchy. So that being said, so I point to some of the research on this front. And what we're starting to see is talk about what they call blue mind, which is quite a nice term. And it basically showing that just as green spaces have been shown to improve mental health, blue spaces are emerging as a powerful contributor too. And this is particularly in relation to bodies of water. So this was a marine biologist called Wallace Nichols who wrote this lovely book. And he's been talking about how bodies of water, when you're in, near, or on them, can give you this positive impact. So this is about water in general, not necessarily the oceans in particular. And there was a 2020 study that found that being near, in, or on water can reduce anxiety and stress, boost well-being and happiness, lower heart rates and breathing rates. And this was a study that analyzed 35 peer-reviewed articles, so there's quite a bit of evidence around that. And interestingly, they found that people who simply view videos of blue spaces or marine life also experience reductions in anxiety and overall heart rate. So I wonder if my little video at the top of this presentation helped reduce any anxiety or heart rates going on. I certainly know that spending time out on that kayak with the dolphins helped me, and often does, but hopefully the video has a little bit of a spillover effect as well. At least the research suggests it might. But some of this is, it's not necessarily specific to the ocean. It might be related to bodies of water more generally. And so some of the research is trying to think about what do ocean-specific benefits look like. And so there was population scale data looking in places like Europe and Japan that suggested that those living on the coast correlate, so correlation, not causation, but correlation with higher self-reported health, happiness, and overall life satisfaction. And, pointing to correlation is important because other research shows that, when it comes to being close to the ocean, there's a range of factors that may be important, so both environmental and social factors. And so part of it is around the fact that you get cleaner air, cooler summers, recreation opportunities, but also the fact that people with higher incomes tend to live closer to the ocean, and so there might be other, factors that mean that high income people generally experience longer life. Anyway, so how do you isolate out these different factors? I think there's still work to be done there. But nonetheless, in general, it seems that access to ocean spaces do provide or may add years to your life, realizing that's a complicated causal story. And yeah, I think one of the interesting elements that some of the researchers are showing is that also time in the ocean can lead and help build social cohesion, both within the family units, and so there were studies done around families spending time together at the beach and how that helped them feel more socially bonded as a family. In some ways that doesn't feel like the most revolutionary outcome of a study. I think maybe those of us who have spent time at the ocean with our families would agree with it, I hope, unless you had really difficult family experiences at the beach, which is possible. But yeah, other studies have also found that blue spaces can help build social cohesion in unrelated individuals. And here I did think a little bit about the Iscia journeys, the identity and social cohesions in Africa. Chair does these, those of you who've been affiliated with it know, they do these journeys out into nature and often in beautiful blue spaces as well. And I think there is something really there that helps connect people in ways that you might not have if you were in more sort of built environments, less nature oriented. And so, yeah, I think there's some really interesting questions there about how you can use these spaces to help build social cohesion. And I think this has important political, social ramifications when we think about, how do we bring people together, particularly in a country like ours. And so these researchers, White and Powell, also engaged on this 4-year research project investigating how these spaces can help us cope with and recover from stresses. So some interesting research ongoing. And I tried to dive a little bit and look into some of the spaces that showed us where the ocean specific benefits are, because it's hard to separate what is just access to water, what is more access to nature in general, and what is specifically related to the ocean. And some of the answers I got was that the ocean air is charged with negative ions, which helps lung function, increases oxygen absorption. The clinical psychologists have suggested that staring at the ocean can change our brain waves and put us into a mild meditative state. That seems to track from personal experience. Psychologists also suggest that listening to waves can activate the parasympathetic nervous system, so this is the calm nervous system, which then decreases stress and allows us to slow down, which is probably a good thing. And also other research suggests that rhythmic, repetitive sound of crashing waves can stimulate what they call alpha brain waves, which again helps reduce anxiety, increases calmness, and contributes to creativity. So all really valuable things. I anticipated we'd have some open water swimmers with us, but I don't think they are on this call. Some of them might be. But I thought I'd just add in this little study that showed that open water swimmers tend to have increased emotional and social benefits, including sense of belonging and formation of new friendships, according to studies at least, and mental benefits like mindfulness, resilience building, and an increased ability to listen to one's body is what they said, which is an interesting one. But maybe to move into the more transcendental elements of ocean connection, and think about what makes oceans particularly good for our overworked mind. There's this book by Dr. Catherine Kelly, and suggest that sort of the oceans and their immersive soundtracks and expansive views and their sort of like endless horizons invite us to pay attention in a different kind of way, which helps develop a sense of awe, where we get perspective on our problems and feel part of something bigger than ourselves. And the sort of sense of awe tends to occur when we connect with something vast that reminds us of our relatively small place in the world. And again, it's an emotion that's known to reduce stress, engage a sense of purpose, and also to push us to act more selflessly. And this is supported. There was a series of studies from several Chinese universities published in 2024 that showed that time in nature increases our perceptions of other people's humanness, so it helps develop empathy. And this is grounded in feelings of transcendence or the emotion of awe that makes us feel like we are part of something bigger than ourselves. Let me check my time and think about how fast I should move through this. I think I've still got a fair amount of time actually, so I can move at a leisurely pace. So one of the things that I do is I do a lot of free diving, and I've started instructing free diving relatively slowly but surely. And one of the things we teach in free diving is something called the dive reflex. It used to be called the mammalian dive reflex because it was thought that we shared it with other mammals, and marine mammals in particular, but we've subsequently come to realize that it's something that we also share with not just mammals, but there are other creatures that have it, like reptiles. So certain marine reptiles, like marine iguanas, can actually have this reflex. And basically the way that it works is when you put your face in water and you try to dive down, not necessarily even when you dive down, but when you put your face in water, this reflex starts to get triggered, and it's a physiological reflex. And basically what happens is your body recognizes that you're in water, and so that it realizes it needs to conserve oxygen. So a whole range of things start happening in your body. Your blood starts to flow up from your extremities, so your arms and your legs, towards your core. So your body is preserving your blood for your more important organs. And then your heart rate starts to slow down quite significantly. And interestingly, there's a reason why if you jump in water you might pee a lot, because as you'll get so much blood flowing to your internal organs, it kind of tricks your kidneys into thinking you are more hydrated than you are, so you start peeing a lot. So there is a scientific reason why if you are in the oceans you pee a lot more. But that's not the most important part of this dive reflex. The more important thing is the calming of the body, the slowing down of the nervous system. And I think why I really love to teach this is because it kind of shows our interconnectedness to other living beings. The fact that we share a similar reflex in how we go into water, and that dolphins and seals and marine iguanas all do something similar. Their bodies respond in similar ways, and I think it speaks to our sort of evolutionary history as humans. And I think there is something beautiful about connecting to the ocean and understanding our shared sort of abilities within it. And I like to think that it moves us from this sort of more human at the top of the evolutionary chain dominating nature to a more sense of ourselves as part of it. And I do think there's strong possibilities of seeing ourselves in that way through understanding our connection and our relations to other natural beings. But I think there's also something really nice about also thinking about just how weird and strange and different some creatures are. And so someone special in my life gave me this book here, Life Between the Tides, and it's a really beautiful book. It explores like all the strange little creatures in our rock pools, and the sea anemone is quite an amazing thing. In quite a few ways, it's able to reproduce both through like sending out eggs and sperm and all of that, but it can also reproduce asexually just by cloning itself, right? And these sea anemones they basically form these colonies, and what they're able to do is within the colonies is there's different sea anemones that play different roles. The sea anemones on the outside are able to detect if there's different sea anemones that are encroaching on their territory, and if they do, they sort of call the sort of inner layer, which is the more protective guard-like sea anemones that then fight them off. And the way that sea anemones are able to tell this is because they clone themselves. They create a colony of their own clones. So you've got like a colony of clones that can detect if they are similar, if they're part of the same family, right, or the same lineage. And if a sea anemone detects a sea anemone that isn't part of the same lineage, they'll fight it and push it off, because there's a sort of a competition for scarce space on rocks and so on. So it's quite an interesting story, and I think it just like gives a sense of like just the small little things and just how incredible they are, that this can also inspire an awe and appreciation for other forms of living, just spending time playing and being curious in ocean spaces around smaller creatures. So I thought I'd give that as an example. I did want to give a little bit of a reflection on the importance that this can play for children, particularly. And so there's this term called nature deficit disorder, which journalist Richard Love coined, although I've also seen another philosopher talk about the term ecological deficit disorder, so I'm not sure if Richard Love was really the one who termed this, but similar ideas. And basically it suggests that the lack of connection that children have to nature is giving rise to attention disorders and depression. And I've been really fortunate to work with a group that is working to connect young people to nature, which I'll talk about in a bit. But I think when we look at children and their access to nature, there's a real like host of benefits that they can potentially get. And this is trying to summarize a lot of the research from that book that I showed you, Nature in the Mind, and a few other spaces. But you get this form of attention restoration where you're able to pay better directed attention, which is pretty key in helping children on a number of fronts, including an increased ability to learn, and also an enhanced capacity to avoid danger through being able to make better decision making by being more grounded in their attention abilities. And supposedly with that comes an ability to be more fully engaged in life. An interesting element is also reduced myopia, short-sightedness. I think because children spend a lot of time on screens, their eyes are like a muscle that adapts to what they're seeing. And so if you spend a lot of time looking at screens, your eyes will become better at that and less good at looking further. And so time spent outdoors can actually reduce myopia, and that's not necessarily, you don't have to be spending all day out there, but a little bit of time every day can actually contribute to that. And studies suggest also that more time spent at the beach for children can lead to fewer emotional and social difficulties and more emotional and social strength, as well as increased levels of creativity. And so this recognition is starting to filter into a range of what they call forest schools, as well as beach schools is less common, but it's kind of happening. And here locally we have this wonderful group called Eco Youth Circles, which is part of another non-profit called Cultural Connections, and they do really amazing after-school activities where they bring together young people to engage in nature spaces. And I've been really impressed by their work. So I've been on a couple of their excursions, and this is just anecdotal. It's not scientific evidence or anything like that, but what the immersive time in nature allows for in terms of not just kids feeling happier and healthier and so on, but their willingness to be more open and connected and vulnerable and present with each other is truly astounding. And so I think it's a really fascinating example, and particularly in the ocean spaces, the sort of the joy and the openness and the curiosity that comes has been really impressive. So yeah, I think I'll end off with just some reflections on maybe what I kind of teased in the description to this talk, and these are perhaps the most sort of exploratory ideas that aren't necessarily grounded in hard science or anything like that. But there's a significant part of me that senses, at least from personal experience and from what I've seen, is that our connection to the oceans and our time spent in them can really help us to develop a bit more of a liberatory imagining, and to sort of push back against some of the more confined ways of thinking that is often pushed upon us. And I think that's particularly around the fact that our Earth is so bordered and boundaried and so on, and there's an openness and a fluidness to the ocean space that I think can make us feel more connected both to nature and to each other. And so I think there is a liberatory potential that is worth exploring, and how we can use those spaces to foster that sort of consciousness within both younger and older generations. And that's something I'm really eager to explore. And I think this is maybe just me pointing to where I need to do more research. But I think it's tricky, because often when we expose people to like beautiful common spaces, natural commons, it's often through lenses of like some problematic environmental theory. So I think it's not necessarily the case that, you know, if you expose someone to the ocean and you give them some environmental education, therefore they're going to turn into like radical environmentalists that are going to, you know, overthrow capitalism and save the world. I don't think there's a linear sort of pathway there, because you can, and I've seen environmental education that kind of ties us into really problematic ideas of humanity and our relationship to the environment. So I thought I was being quite clever when I called this the tragedy of the commons, but it turns out somebody else uses this term before, calling the tragedy of the commons a tragedy. And I think many people who know environmental work will be familiar with the idea of the tragedy of the commons. So if we have some shared resource, a commons, and we people have some sort of incentive to take from it. And so the classic example is a field or a pasture where cattle will go graze. And the claim is, because everybody's kind of like individually selfish, they will just be incentivized to just continually take and take and take, and they will deplete the resource unless there's some sort of outside force that blocks them from doing so and governs the selfishness of humanity. That's, you know, it's a little bit of maybe not the best characterization of it, but in a nutshell. And I think this has become like quite a common framing in how we do teach some environmental education, and, you know, how we kind of introduce people to the idea of their relationship to natural spaces is through this idea that there is like this innate human selfishness that we need to govern when it comes to natural spaces. And I think that it's an assumption that also goes to the heart of a lot of our economic theory, where you have like the idea of the selfish individual interest maximizer. That's really at the heart of a lot of economic thinking too. And some of those really fundamental assumptions, both in some environmental thought and economic thought, aren't necessarily grounded in, you know, a true understanding of human nature, of how we connect to each other, of what drives us, and are often informed by really problematic ideas. So the guy who put forward the tragedy of the commons, and this is where I found out that somebody else had used the idea of the tragedy of the commons, but Garrett Hardin was the person who initially proposed the idea of the tragedy of the commons, and he was a pretty awful racist, a eugenicist, a nativist, an Islamophobe. He's the sort of guy who would argue for building walls and keeping immigrants out. He would also argue for things like we shouldn't send aid to poor countries, it should let them die because of overpopulation and the fact that they can't take care of the environment. He was a really, really awful human being. And his ideas were at the heart of the tragedy of the commons. He kind of influenced it. And so through that ignored a lot of really important examples of how indigenous and other communities are able to self-govern environmental resources and often live in harmony. Harmony is a complicated word, but live well with their natural environments. And that sort of thinking led to a lot of fortress conservation, a lot of really problematic ways in which we've boundaried and excluded people from spaces. And, you know, I think if we use a similar sort of lens of how we view the commons when it comes to the oceans, we can, and I've seen that in some of the environmental education talks that some folks have given related to ocean spaces, where like there's this really negative lens of tragedy of the commons that gets put forward. And this is not to say we mustn't be realistic about some of the challenges facing our ocean spaces, but I think we also need to ground our understanding of common spaces in the rich sort of history of how humanity has been able to govern and appreciate common spaces. And so I think many of you who maybe work in the environmental space will know the work of Elinor Ostrom. She was the first female Nobel Prize winner, and she won the Nobel Prize in economics. And her life work was really showing about how throughout history common spaces have been sustained through community institutions and a diversity of institutions where humans have been able to manage their shared environment. And I think this plays out where we've seen traditionally, smaller fishing communities being able to govern their their livelihoods and resources in fishing communities quite well. Of course, the problem comes in when regulations sort of suppress those traditional forms of governance, and then you also have regulations which allow large scale, like corporate fishing fleets, to come in and end up doing a lot of the harm, and then we erode some of the traditional governance mechanisms. But again, this is not my area of firm expertise. I think there's some people on this call here who know this better than me. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that, just because we expose people to the ocean commons doesn't necessarily create like a more radical environmental ethic. I think it depends on how we guide them through that experience, and that's, if we teach people a relation to the commons that's grounded in the sense of how humanity has historically related to nature well, and how it's been central to community and connection, that it can be liberatory. And so I think in summary, I'm trying to say that, playing in our beautiful oceans can help inspire awe, transcendence, and empathy, can build mental and physical health, can grow community well-being, and there's a random E in there that I don't know where that comes from, but it can also grow social cohesion, foster connectedness to nature and to each other, and hopefully, if we do it well, it can be used as a tool for more liberatory understandings of humanity and of our relationship to each other and nature. So that's me. Thank you very much for taking time out of your Friday afternoon to listen to me ramble about the wonders of the ocean and how it hopefully benefits us. If you have any thoughts or feedback, you're welcome to get in touch. But I will leave it there.
Alex, thank you. And lots and lots and lots to think about. If you want to kind of, engage with Alex, just stick your hand up, and I'll open it up for you to chat. And in the meantime, while you gather your thoughts, I can see lots of claps and things going up the screen. It seems to me, Alex, that would you say that, I mean, just being in nature, that's one thing that would provide a whole lot of benefits, but maybe you also need to play in nature. Do you think that the two, I mean, or could it be that you're just laboring away in nature and that's also okay? I don't know. Or is the play component important?
That is a good question. I think that would require some scientific studies. I imagine working in nature itself has its own benefits, and just time in nature in general would. And I think there is, some of the studies did suggest that just, spending time, it doesn't have to be playful. But I do think there is something, particularly about the oceans, that does invite play and non-productive use of our time. And I think there is something really lovely about that. How much that lends to more health and physical benefits, I'm not sure. But I have a feeling it's a really important part of being more fully human, at least. Playing in spaces like that.
Okay, so let me, as I said, just stick up your hand if you want to chat to Alex. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you in the meantime, then we'll go over to Glenn quickly after that, is this idea of putting your face or tapping into your inner dolphin. I love that. So putting your face in water to kind of calm your nervous system down and all of that. Can you do that in the bath, you think, or in a basin? Would it work? Or do you actually need to be out in the ocean or something?
Yeah. So there are some people that suggest you should just like put your face in water, submerge it, and then you will get some of these benefits. I think you do need to submerge yourself for a little while before it really starts coming in. But I think it is possible to get outside of being like fully immersed in a big body of water. But it is quite a lovely thing to experience. And I think there's also within freediving a certain type of breathing that you do that helps slow the heart rate too. So there's a nice things to do together.
Okay, so it would take a bit of time. You can't just stick your face in water for a couple of seconds. It would have to be a kind of like a swim in your
Yeah.
bath. Or
Yeah, it takes a little while longer to kick in, but I think even if you just splash water on your face, it begins to stimulate that. And actually, the areas that are particularly sensitive to it are around here. Apparently, these are areas that are sensitive to the effects of water. Yeah.
awesome, gonna try it. Okay, Glenn, let's hear from you, and then Nina.
Hi, Alex. It was so wonderful to hear your explanation about Gugompo City, and thanks for that. I did tune in as your video was playing. Apologies for being late. And you never disappoint with your beautiful remarks. It was so soothing. I loved the blue and the green, and that was also true in what you were demonstrating to us. But it struck me that what if some of this affinity to the ocean, to nature, to well being for myself personally as a musician, for example, I am stimulated by the beauty of nature visually, but I am drawn sonically to the sounds of nature. And you had touched on that. And then there are others living amongst us in society who are just not in tune with nature at all. And I wanted to ask you, how much of this is personality driven, do you think? Because I'm even thinking about the spiritual attachment which some societies or communities or individuals have to the ocean, to bodies of water, to trees, to healing with traditional herbs and so forth. But it's not universal. And I just wanted to find out, could we say then in the way that cultures develop with particular affinities based on where they are located, we could perhaps see the same thing happening on the individual level.
Yeah.
Is it personality driven? And then lastly, I also wanted to just point out it was interesting for me to hear about how the affluency or economic stature of people living amongst the ocean could contaminate the results of trying to assess is this actually meaningful to longevity and well-being. But that's why I love living in the Eastern Cape here, because as you know, driving along the coast and the wild coast, you encounter what would be regarded as very rural, impoverished communities right on the banks of
Yeah.
the ocean. And I wonder what their lifespan might be. I suspect very long. But you've given us so much to think about. Looking forward to
Mm.
hearing what you think about that personality question.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Glenn. Yeah, it's lovely. The audio part is really interesting. I think and I don't know if there has been studies on like the audio effects of connection to the ocean just through the sounds. As part of doing research for this, I was actually listening to a podcast. South Africa has one of the first people who qualified to scuba dive who's deaf. I mean, who's blind. Sorry, who's blind. And so she's going underwater. She can't see anything. She's just listening to the marine world around her, which seems fascinating. But I think outside of the oceans, just on the coastline as well, that sound, I mean, some of the studies were suggesting that it's really like, it's quite hypnotic, it puts you into a different state of mind. And so I think there really is significant benefits. And I think they've played and connected music and ocean sounds together for a really long time. And so I think there's a strong recognition of that. So yeah, I'd be curious what the evidence suggests around the impacts of that and how you could combine that with music and what that does to us. And yeah, it would be curious also to then study in the Eastern Cape like the effects of access to ocean, and particularly with poor communities, and how you separate out the different factors. And these are really complex social science questions, well outside my expertise, but I think there's really fascinating research to be done there about how ocean connection does contribute to longevity, well-being, happiness, a sense of cultural belonging to. And yeah, I think the question around personality is a tricky one here. It's, I've been reading a little bit around like this idea of sort of epigenetics, right? Is that, we have certain innate like things within our genetics that might be expressed or not, depending on whether our environment allows them to flourish or not. And I think for the most part, I would guess that our attraction to nature, our willingness to spend time it is based on our childhoods and how much time we've had as younger people being connected to those spaces, and that those who haven't really had those abilities will be more fearful, less attuned to the benefits, and maybe less willing to go out there. But this is me just sort of guessing and basing it on sort of lived experience. And so I think this also then speaks to, the importance of how do we work in spaces where there is like very limited access to green and blue spaces, and how do we foster some of those connections maybe from a younger age to help build that affinity. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's certain personality types that just don't like it, even though they've been exposed to it. But I'm not sure. Yeah.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, phew. Nina.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was really interesting and really enjoyed that. I've never been in this sort of forum or this little group before. So for those who don't know me, I'm Nina and I'm based in Cape Town. I'm also a free diver, and that's how Alex and I met. And yeah, and I've been in the ocean governance space for quite a few years. I'm a social scientist, anthropologist by training, and really been working in the ocean governance space, specifically in marine spatial planning. And your last slide, Alex, when you were just talking about sort of the connections, the exploratory connections that we can make in this body of water that is so much bigger than us. And I think over the years, I've been struck by, marine spatial planning in itself is kind of like this new sexy thing that has hit South African shores, which is very problematic in itself, because it takes a sort of like Cartesian logic, and it tries to map the ocean, and in order for authorities to map it and manage it, basically. And it always reminds me of the hubris of humans to think that we can try and manage something that is so vast and so interconnected and so complex. And obviously, yes, we do need to look after it and we do need to steward it. But I think, you were also talking about people just playing in the ocean, and I think an access to the ocean, and a lot of the times, people do want to play, and they do want to look after the ocean, and mixed in with the tragedy of the commons. But the reality is that we have a government that is still very top down, in the way that they govern the ocean, and it's not very it's quite exclusionary. Yeah. So I think, I'm stating the obvious, but just having worked in this space for quite a long time, we see that there's like a paradigm shift that's coming from like the international sphere, the regional sphere, even in like the Western Indian Ocean, where people are saying we really need to, the way that we govern oceans and look after and steward has to be participatory. It has to be grassroots. It has to be equitable. And yeah, I think it's when you've got these monolithic institutions that have, that are based and established on fortress conservation, it's a really difficult thing to shift. But I think, yeah, having discussions like this, and I was really interested in the beach schools as well, that you spoke about. Where were those? Or the one that you attended?
Yeah, so the beach schools are quite new. I haven't seen too many examples of them. Forest schools are much more common, and they're often more near European and the Nordic countries and so on. There's examples of the forest schools there, but there are some like examples of beach schools as well. And then the one I attended wasn't necessarily a formal beach school, but it was like, they didn't call themselves that anyway, but we spent time on the beach learning, connecting, doing fun activities, and it was, yeah, it's amazing. And I think, there are a lot of initiatives that take young people into those spaces, but formalizing it into our education and like providing more resources to sport, it seems really valuable.
And then, sorry, I just had one question. I didn't really, the question is, did you, in your research for this, did you come across, the Wim Hof method and cold water immersion and all of that? Did you look into that at all? Because I know, that there's been such a movement of people saying it's so good for you, and then other people saying not so much. So did you come across anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I was looking at some of the benefits of like spending time in the ocean and, the cold, relative cold of the ocean. I didn't look specifically at like extreme cold water immersion for this. And then, yeah, the Wim Hof method I think is quite controversial because what it's supposed to do is shock your system into a state of almost stress, right? Which is kind of the opposite of what we try to do for free diving, which is to get your body into a state of calm. And so, free divers suggest it's not a great method and it like increases stress overall, and so that there's other methods of breathing that are certainly better for free diving and probably better for your overall health. So I think, yeah, the Wim Hof method is kind of frowned upon in free diving community, certainly. But I don't know enough about it to give you a proper scientific assessment.
Well, thank you for the talk. It was really interesting.
Thanks for that feedback. Lots in there that I can dig into. But I think maybe just to connect to your point about marine spatial planning, I mean, one of the things here is also about like who counts as a stakeholder when we think about the valuing and the participation in marine spatial planning, because there's people love to play and connect there. So it's not just those that use it productively for the blue economy that are the proper stakeholders, right? They are
And there's also
all
rights holders. It's not just stakeholders, it's who have the rights as well.
yeah,
Mm.
exactly. Yeah, but thank you. I think yeah, it's nice to have somebody with a bit more experience in this space providing feedback. So thank you, Nina.
Okay. Thanks, Nina. Adrian.
Hi, Alex. Thanks for a wonderful talk. It was awesome, and it made me want to go for a swim. So, yeah. I actually, just on the Wim Hof point, I think, as far as I can tell, like Wim Hof is based on like a much older breathing technique, and as far as I know, I've tried it a little bit. All the benefits that he speaks of actually just comes from the breathing. That's as far as I can tell. I'm not an expert on it. So just the actual intentional breathing practice, the hyperventilating and the holding and all that sort of thing, if you do it properly, obviously. I'm not
Yeah.
sure
Okay.
how the cold water actually comes into it.
Mhm.
Um, and then, yeah, so thanks. The one thing I loved in your talk, Alex, was the idea of the commons. And I was so excited to hear about it because I'd actually only found out about the idea of a commons at all this year when I was reading a book where some guy was talking about the Charter of the Forest in England and the history of the commons and stuff. And I wondered, because I think your point about the tragedy of the commons is so true that when people try and like create these positive spaces, but it's kind of like surrounded by just the capitalist structure, they always fail, and then the tragedy of the commons kind of like comes into play. And kind of you mentioned you like touched on some ways to get around that, and I was wondering if you could speak more on like how do we go from a natural space being like just a space of enjoyment where we can like seek solitary well-being to an actual community commons? Like, what's your yeah, I don't know if you have any ideas on that or because it's such an inspiring idea.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Adrian. That's really, really important and big question. And I think it speaks a little bit also to Anzel put this lovely comment in the chat here about Achille Mbembe, and I need to look into that more. But I think part of the colonial project was eroding a lot of the ways in which we had communities already had connections to each other and to the land, and that there was like common governance structures. And so a lot of the colonial history is about eroding those and eroding connection to the land to force people into migratory labor, to dispossess them of their land so that it could be, pushed into capitalist extraction and so on. So I think, certainly lots of lessons throughout history of what those sort of commons structures look like. There's a philosopher I really like, a guy called Kyle Powers White. He's based in America, an indigenous philosopher there, and he writes a lot about what those traditional governance structures look like in like how we govern common spaces, and how they're built on things like trust and reciprocity and different forms of relationship between each other, and it's actually quite beautiful in a lot of ways. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done in looking to like previous governance structures, and of course, given that we are subsumed under sort of a large capitalist economic system, there are big challenges about how we make those real and how we build different types of common structures that can live and thrive under capitalism, or at least then start to shift us away from it. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there. But yeah, I think the work of Kyle Pass White is definitely worth looking at on that front. And he's really interesting. He works, it's not just a philosophy, he's working in spaces where they're trying to rebuild some of these ways of governing in common, and doing research and working with communities around that, particularly in the face of like climate change impacts and what that means.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. Alex, you mentioned Ansel's comment. I think we should ask her to come on and actually speak about it, just so we can, capture it on our YouTube video.
Yeah.
Ansel?
Oh, putting me on the spot there, eh? Thanks so much. Thanks, Alex. This was really dope. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, you're cool. This is very cool. Fun. Makes me want to go swim in the ocean.
Nice. If I've only done
So
that, then I'm happy.
great. So I was wondering, but it seems like you did. You have encountered Mbembe and his work.
A little bit, but please say more for the sake of the
Okay.
video, as Andrea points out.
Okay, all good. I'll try and be quick. So I was just wondering if you've encountered Mbembe and specifically his critique of Black reason with regard to Afro-Puritanism. I think it would really complement your argument, given the South African context. He writes about African subjectivity, mobility, and the possibilities of a post-colonial commons. And in his more recent work, so this is very particular, and I really think that this one in particular will be very helpful. It's called Out of the Dark Night. And then he also wrote a whole bunch of like COVID era essays where he writes about the commons and what he calls the community of the living, which is a vision of shared planetary existence that cuts across colonial divisions between the human and non-human worlds. He argues that the colonial crisis and the ecological crisis are similar crises because they proceed from a logic of extraction and enclosure. So I just wanted to bring it back to the philosophy.
Yeah.
Thank
No,
you.
that's great. Thanks so much. And I mean, I'm familiar with some of Mbembe's work, but not this specific argument from Out of the Dark Night. So I'm definitely going to dive into that. And just from what you've read there, it certainly rings true. And like a lot of my analysis has been to try and connect how, that same logic of extraction has been at the heart of both ecological, colonial, and also like our general extractive economic system, right? And then that forms a form of what I think of as like an eco-apartheid, where like the benefits of that system are held in the hands of an elite few, and the harms of it are spread across the global majority, both human and non-human. So yeah, I think there's some really powerful and important points there. So thank you for that recommendation. I'm definitely going to dive into it.
Awesome. Nina, we have 1 minute, so if you can be super quick, and then let's end off with
Sure. I just wanted to kind of reply, or as a response to Ansel, I'm so interested to read Mbembe's work now. It sounds so cool. So some of the work that I've also been looking into is how Indigenous knowledge can inform marine spatial planning and governance as well. And it's so interesting when he talks about the community of the living, because I'd be interested how he defines community of the living, because when you look at a lot of like Xhosa cosmology as well, and indigenous thinking, a lot of it also like reaches back to ancestors, to the spirits, who we don't usually term as living, but they are. They can be. And with the shell case on the Wild Coast, one of the big taglines there was, "You can't mine heaven," because a lot of people believe that like the ancestors live in the ocean. So yeah, that was just a thought that I had, and I'm going to look at Mbembe.
Fabulous. Alex, last word?
No, that seems like a lovely place to end. I think we should probably wrap up so everybody who is
Can
able
go to the
can get
ocean,
to the
yeah.
beach. Yeah.
We're going to walk, we're going to swim, even though it's winter. I'm going to go put my face in there. All right.
Thank you. Thanks,
Okay.
everybody. I really appreciate the
Yeah.
feedback and the comments. Yeah.
Fantastic. And thank you, Alex. It was wonderful. And yeah, see you all next semester. Okay. All right.